There will be, after the session, an email with the slides, the recording, and kind of signposting to any resources. So hopefully that's all clear. And it seems like my Zoom has decided to stop. And I can't move my slides. Chanel, I don't know if you can help me. Great, thanks so much. Good to get any glitches out of the way early. So just a quick note on kind of Small Charity Week, which this event is a part of. So Small Charity Week runs from the 20th to the 24th of June. There are lots of activities put on by partner organisations, including events and advice. And this week really celebrates and raises awareness of the essential work of small charities. And there is a Small Charity Week website you can look at to find out more about some of those different activities. So just quickly moving on to introductions. So my name's Rebecca. I am the policy lead at NCVO. We represent and champion charities and volunteering in England. I'll pass over to Caroline, so you can introduce yourself, Caroline.
Hi, I'm Caroline. I'm the Policy and National Programmes Manager at Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales. So we partner with small and local charities tackling complex social issues.
Thanks, Caroline. We also have Chanel, who's producing today, and there will be kind of facilitators, and you'll meet those in the breakout rooms. So quickly running through our agenda for today, we will be presenting what we know about the experiences of small charities and why they're important. And as a part of that, we'll be talking a little bit about what we're doing to support small charities and how small charities are responding to some of those challenges. We'll then have a good amount of time for a breakout discussion where it'd be great for you to talk about your experiences and what's important to you. So I'm now going to pass over to Caroline to talk a little bit about small charities and the funding environment for them.
Thanks, Rebecca. So obviously it's Small Charities Week this week, but why do we care about small charities? So as you probably know, most charities are small. 96% have an income under £1 million, 80% have an income under 100k. Yet we also know that these charities make up a tiny fraction of the total income of the sector. And too often, conversations about charities can be dominated by considerations of large household name organisations, but these types of organisations can be quite different to the types of charities that we're focusing on today. And if you want to find out more about interesting stats about small charities, head over to smallcharitiesdata.org, which draws together information from a range of sources, and there is a data refresh this week, so that'll have all the kind of latest information, bringing it together so you can find out everything you ever wanted to know about small charities on the data side. Next slide, please. So why do we care about small? Why do we care about small charities? So small charities are distinctive, not just because they have less money, but they're also distinctive in what they do, how they do it, and where they do it. And that's not just me saying it. Back in 2018, the foundation published some independent research, which highlighted that small and local charities are distinctive. So the research, called The Value of Small, found that the services are distinctive. So the services charities offer are distinctive. So for example, they might be first responders, they might be providing spaces that are free of stigma. Secondly, they found that small charities have a distinctive approach, so providing person-centered services. They're embedded in communities and build high levels of trust. They have diversity that reflects the community, and typically they reach early and stay longer, so they're helping people throughout the whole course of when they need support. And thirdly, small charities hold a distinctive position in the wider ecosystem. So they're often referred to as the glue that hold communities together and help to build local networks and relationships. But while these distinctive features are interesting in and of themselves, it really matters because it's these distinctive features which help to make small charities so valuable in terms of the value that they generate. Next slide, please. It'll come. In terms of the research demonstrated that small charities generate value, and it can be broken down into 4 main areas. And hopefully there'll be a slide in a minute that will show you what those areas are. But the first one is value for individuals. So small local charities are particularly good at helping people to achieve soft outcomes. There we go. Back one. So building confidence and resilience, which can be the foundations, for example, of helping people into longer term outcomes, like moving into employment or stable accommodation. Secondly, there's value to the economy. So particularly the local economy. So that might be through employing local people, using local providers, and all helping to recycle money around that local economy. Thirdly is value to public services. So by reducing demand on other services such as GP or A&E admissions, and helping to address the root causes of the challenges that people face, so they don't need to draw on a wide range of other public services. And fourthly, there's added value. So that includes things like the volunteering opportunities that small charities provide, and helping to build social capital and networks. It's worth noting that while that research was published in 2018, last year we published a refresh called The Value of Small in a Big Crisis, which went back and looked at the case study areas from the original report to see, what is this framework, is this way that we're thinking about charities still true when you're in a crisis situation? If you haven't read the research, spoiler alert, it found that it is, that actually these distinctive features and the way that charities generate value still come through when you're working in crisis conditions. But we know that while small charities are vital and generate heaps of value, they're under pressure. So we've seen a catalogue of challenges over many years, and the cost of living crisis is the latest focus. And with each crisis, we see increasing demand in terms of the numbers of people needing support, but also the complexity of support that people are needing. And these challenges are particularly acute for Black, Asian and minority ethnic-led charities due to the addition of structural racism and the amplification of intersecting inequalities. Next slide, please. Yet when things are tough, hopefully on the next slide you'll see at some point, we see that charities can continue to adapt and improve their responses to try and rise to these challenges. So during COVID, this was particularly evident around how many charities shifted their services overnight so that they could start delivering digitally, so that they could continue providing support even when the external environment was so different. We also saw strength in collaboration in many areas, so not just between charities, but with statutory agencies and businesses as well. And we also saw charities working in different ways with communities, so engaging new people and developing new services to meet emerging needs. Next slide, please. And when we talk to charities about challenges they face, the funding environment is never far from the centre of conversations. So this is a quote from a charity that we fund, but it's reflective of similar things we hear from so many, and I think highlights the cumulative impact of successive crises. So sustainable funding is the kind of core challenge. You have kind of short-term intervention, so emergency funding that's coming to a close, alongside the cost of living crisis, which is impacting on what other sources of income people can access. Next slide, please. Now, access to government funding is frequently raised by the charities that we partner with. And as you can see from this graph, while government income is still significant for charities, it's declining as a proportion of income that charities receive. And government income to small charities in particular has declined by 20% in real terms over 5 years. And that's something, again, that you'll be able to see more clearly in the data refresh on small charities data this week as well. So a squeeze on public spending is a factor that's impacting on this kind of declining proportion, but we've also seen the shift to larger scale contracts as a key driver of this trend. Next slide, please. It's worth remembering, though, that for the smallest charities, that income from government makes up a smaller proportion of total income. Of the charities that we fund at the foundation, so those with an income between 25,000 and £1 million, it's those at the higher end of the income bracket that tend to be involved in public sector commissioning, so are kind of more linked into that government funding. Next slide, please. So perhaps unsurprisingly, we know the pandemic has impacted on finances. Rising demand meant that charities needed access to more resources, but trading income all but stopped. Many independent funders closed their grants programs to shift to emergency funding. Those who had diversified, been told for years, diversify your income, it will make you more sustainable. Actually, they face the greatest challenges in many cases. And these patterns are continuing to some extent as people have less disposable income as the cost of living crisis continues. So it's not that we're seeing short-term challenges, but actually that they kind of linger on. So 46% of charities use reserves during the pandemic, which is perhaps not surprising given that they're there to be able to enable charities to respond when they face particular challenges, but does raise questions about how they'll be replenished when the funding environment remains so tough. And new data published on small charities data this week shows that the number of small and medium charities, so an income between 10k and 1 million, has fallen as charities drop down income brackets as a result of falling income. And while these challenges are considerable for all, they've typically had the greatest impact on those charities that are led by and for marginalised communities. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about funding, we often talk about competition as well. For many years, we've heard about competition being a problem for government funds, but it's increasingly identified as a problem with independent funding as well, as charities are looking for support from from the same places. So again, this is a quote from a charity that we fund, talking about the challenges of accessing independent funding and the competition for both government and independent funding as well. Next slide, please. If we're thinking about funding environment, we can't forget the challenges that small charities in particular face when it comes to commissioning. So the move from grants to contracts has led to shifts from collaboration to competition. And we know that one of the biggest challenges is around the short-term nature of funding through government funding and commissioning, and the timing for that as well. So with late decisions and short timescales to apply for funding, that quite often ends up coinciding with school holidays, which make it even more difficult for small charities to apply. Now, the nature of this funding impacts on services, on the services that people can access, but it also access on the people working in those services as well, and the job insecurity that comes from the commissioning context. And Rebecca will pick up on that a bit more later. We also know that too often contracts don't cover the full cost of running the service and rarely account for sufficient inflationary increase, which is obviously a particular problem at the moment. And the scale and generic nature of many contracts exclude those specialist and local services that are embedded in communities. Next slide, please. So again, this is a quote from a charity that we fund about the ongoing challenges of commissioning that feel like it's set up for much bigger organisations, and that's something that we hear a lot from the charities we work with at the foundation. Next slide, please. But all of these challenges need to be considered alongside the reality of rising costs. So charities that we fund that own properties are particularly worried about rising energy costs, but these increasing costs are impacting all charities. I think it's important to remember that the cost of living crisis isn't just affecting us as individuals, but is affecting organisations too. Next slide, please. So that's obviously all very depressing, but yet again, we see charities responding in different ways, particularly around diversifying funding and prioritising allocating specific resources towards income generation so that charities can try and make sure they do have the resources to meet the growing demand that they're kind of anticipating will continue. Next slide, please. And as frontline organisations adapt to the challenges, we and others are trying to address some of these challenges through influencing. So, for example, the procurement bill is currently going through Parliament. Now, this will basically set the rules for how government buys public services or pays for public services. And so we're trying to make sure that those rules address some of the challenges that small charities face when it comes to commissioning and procurement, for example, by increasing co-production and collaboration, breaking contracts down into smaller lots, and focusing on a proportionate approach. At a local level, the foundation's been working with locality on an initiative called Keep It Local, and that's about building a network of local authorities committed to improving how they work with local charities, such as through how they approach commissioning. I can put a link to that in the chat later for anyone that wants to know more. But while we're interested in how money is spent, we also need to address how much money there is. So we and others have been pushing for better funding distribution to local authorities, one that's based on levels of need, because we know that local authority funding, more so than central government, can be particularly important for many smaller charities. So we've been calling for a better deal for local authorities so that they have the resources to pay for the services that are needed in their area. We're also working on influencing what levelling up means in practice, and are actively trying to shape the new community spaces and relationship strategy to grow the influence of small charities locally. And recognising the challenging funding environment, NCVO and others are looking at how giving can be encouraged as well. And part of that is thinking through how a community wealth fund might ensure that local areas have, that there's a pot of money that local areas deciding what they do with, and that they're kind of continually investing in the local communities as well. And I'm going to hand over to Rebecca, who's going to talk through some more of the context around workforce.
Thanks, Caroline. We know that workforce is a real challenge for lots of organisations at the moment. For some reason, I can't move my slides again. I wonder if...
do you want to stop sharing? Oh. I'll try.
No, it's all right. It's caught up with me, I think. So yes, lots of organisations experiencing challenges in terms of their workforce. So here we have an organisation talking about real issues recruiting staff, particularly citing kind of the voluntary sector being a kind of a high stress environment, and that having an impact on recruitment and retention. Sorry about this. I wonder if I might need someone else to help me. Thanks, Chanel. So if I could go to the next one, that would be great. Okay, so what is happening to the voluntary sector workforce? So our workforce is growing. So there was a 3% increase in 2020-21, and overall a 20% increase since 2010. 44% of the workforce is employed by charities with fewer than 25 staff, which is a really significant number. And to put this into context, we didn't get the mass layoffs we feared at the end of the furlough scheme. And when we look at the kind of the wider labour market, unemployment is quite low, but economic inactivity, so people of working age being kind of out of work and also not looking for work, is quite high. And organisations have cited things like kind of long-term sickness as a big driver of that. But essentially what we see at the moment is kind of less people in the labour market, and that has kind of issues for the voluntary sector. So Charity Job reported that employer demand for staff is very high, and organisations are really struggling to fill vacancies. And this creates a real kind of pressure to compete for staff, and that is really challenging for organisations that might not be able to offer the kind of the wages and benefits they want to. Low pay is a particular issue, particularly in some parts of the sector, often driven by lack of funding. As kind of Caroline mentioned before, we hear about short-term funding contracts, and that's kind of linked to kind of funding cycles, and that has a knock-on effect for kind of employment contracts. So organisations may not be able to offer the kind of the long-term or kind of permanent employment that people are looking for. Particularly during COVID, organisations reported issues with stress, burnout, poor well-being, linked, I think, to the kind of huge demand for support. And before the pandemic, organisations told us particularly about kind of digital skills gaps, which is something that we've seen kind of improve during the pandemic, with so many organisations kind of upskilling and moving their work online. There are other organisations in the sector doing research into sector productivity and how we improve it. Hybrid and flexible working for many organisations has been a huge opportunity, but also comes with challenges. So many organisations have maintained hybrid working since the start of the pandemic, and polling shows that lots of employees, this is something that they prefer and they look for in employment. The Time to Flex report really encourages flexible approaches to employment, which is important for kind of everyone in the voluntary sector, but particularly important for disabled staff and people with caring responsibilities. There's a number of things that kind of organisations sort of can and should be thinking about when it comes to hybrid working. So it could be reviewing use of office space and what's needed. We've heard of lots of organisations kind of saving money that way. Thinking about how you kind of cater for different needs and preferences, with some preferring home working and others kind of needing to be in the office. And then thinking about remote working and some of the cybersecurity implications of remote working. And just to kind of bring that point about wellbeing to life a little bit, so this is a quote from a learning disability charity, really talking about the impact on kind of staff mental health, but also mental health of people who use their services, citing kind of low morale, and more staff members reaching out for support with mental health. So while this is a really challenging environment, there are things that organisations are doing. So we've already talked about kind of offering kind of flexible and hybrid working, but we also hear about organisations reviewing salaries where they can, increasing supervisions, providing more wellbeing support. So our priorities for influencing change. The real focus of our work is improving the funding environment, so charities can reduce kind of pressure on staff and increase rewards. But we're also thinking about how we address some of the systemic issues that are increasing demand and creating a lot of pressure for organisations. So moving on now to volunteering. There's a quote here from an organisation talking about struggling to retain volunteers, particularly at the end of the furlough scheme. We know that kind of lots of people did kind of volunteer while they were on furlough, but obviously have had to kind of shift their kind of volunteering patterns, particularly with kind of going back to work. So during the pandemic, we saw a decrease in formal volunteering and an increase in informal volunteering. So that kind of links, I think, to the emergence of mutual aid groups, and particularly links also to kind of some organisations having to stop different types of activity or kind of stop volunteering in different ways, depending on what that organisation was focused on. As we kind of enter this next phase of the pandemic, organisations have spoken to us about needing to support the return of volunteers who stepped back during various lockdowns. We've also seen the emergence of some more kind of, I guess, kind of centralised approaches or kind of big volunteering schemes like the NHS Responder scheme. Organisations have reported some difficulty in recruiting and retaining volunteers, particularly issues recruiting a diversity of volunteers. And in all of this, our organisations are led by volunteers, led by trustees, who are kind of navigating all of these complex challenges. And there's a quote here from an organisation citing that particular point. So our priorities for influencing change, we've been working with various partner organisations on a 10-year vision for volunteering that has now been published, and our kind of support for the sector and our government influencing work will really kind of focus on how we kind of implement this vision and make it a reality over the next 10 years. We're also doing a huge amount of work to better understand the experiences of volunteers before the pandemic, we published Time Well Spent about the volunteer experience, and more recently we've been trying to better understand experiences of volunteers during the pandemic, so we can understand how to support them going forward. So now a few points on running a small organisation and some of the challenges that come with that. So as I've just mentioned, trustees have a huge amount to navigate, and often in smaller organisations we'll be kind of offering kind of practical support. There is a very complex regulatory environment for organisations, and that can be a real challenge if you don't have a lot of capacity. Just on kind of digitization, so charities have adapted to the pandemic by working more online, but that does require having the right kind of skills, infrastructure, and also for the people you work with to also have those digital skills and that infrastructure as well. We've recently surveyed our members about their experiences of banking, which has kind of highlighted a number of practical challenges, with things like setting up and switching accounts, but also issues with charging for accounts and different activities. And we also know that access to space is a real issue. So many organisations don't have access to the right kind of space to meet their needs and to help them to deliver their work. We also know that there can be quite sort of challenging relationships at a local level, while there is lots of great partnership working between voluntary organisations and also with local government. We do also hear about challenging relationships with local government, and particular kind of organisations worried about their kind of their independence and their ability to kind of speak out on behalf of the people they represent. But there are lots of ways in which charities are responding. So increased use of digital approaches. We've seen a huge amount of collaboration, collaborative spirit during the pandemic, and also a growing focus on kind of diversity and lived experience to really kind of strengthen their work and their legitimacy. So what are our priorities for influencing change? We are working on those banking issues and thinking about what support the sector needs. Always in our work, we're thinking about how charity regulation is proportionate and also easy for organisations to understand. We are also working on the levelling up agenda, and as Caroline mentioned, particularly the strategy for community spaces and relationships, to really make sure that communities have access to social infrastructure, the spaces, places, relationships that connect us and support well-being. And part of that kind of charities access to kind of space and assets is really important. So now we're moving to the breakout, where we'd really like to hear a little bit more about your experiences. We will have about 20 minutes for this discussion, and it would be great to hear about what are the big challenges you're experiencing, how are you responding, and what action do you want to see from government. That will really kind of help us to prioritise our work on behalf of small charities. Hi everyone. I just need to share my screen again. Just give me 1 second. So hopefully you can all see that. I hope you all had good discussions. I suggest maybe we take just a couple of minutes now to hear from maybe just one very quick point from each facilitator about the different things that might have come up in that discussion. So maybe Chanel, I don't know what the best way of doing this is. Maybe we ask facilitators to raise their hands, and we'll go to kind of each one in turn. I'm happy to say a little bit of what came up in my group. So one of the things we talked about, which I think has gone kind of a little bit kind of quiet in the sector, was the the cost of kind of things like PPE and COVID testing for some organisations, and that still being an issue. Caroline, I'll go to you next.
So one point that came up in ours that we hadn't covered before was around properties and finding appropriate properties at a price that charities can afford, and potentially having to move out of area if there's just nothing available.
Thanks, Caroline. I'll go to Sam next.
Thanks, Rebecca. We talked quite a bit about contracts, contract values being held flat over a number of years. One organization has had their contract at the same level for 11 years, and it's going to be kept at that level going forward. And part of the problem with that is local authorities are closing in-house services because they can't afford them anymore. Charities are picking up the tab, and then government sees charities delivering those services at that level and thinks that's what that service costs to deliver. So they don't see any need to raise the value of the contract.
Thanks, Sam. I'll go to Alex next.
Hello. We discussed actually something related to Caroline's point around property, but it was specifically around local authorities moving to more commercial relationships with the charity sector and shifting from peppercorn rent to commercial rates, and that impact on the VCSE.
Thanks, Alex. I'll come to you next.
Thank you. We've discussed a few things, but mostly it was all around funding and donors. And one of the main things that we spoke about was about retention of staff. That is quite difficult for small charities because lots of times they do need to obviously apply for these grants, and then they have to do it project by project. So it's difficult to keep senior members of staff, and then the private sector might be paying them more as well. So retention of staff is quite a big challenge at the moment.
Thanks so much. I'll go to Josie next.
Thanks, Rebecca. So yeah, we had a bit of a chat around difficulties around just accessing funding. One participant in our group talked about how all of her kind of main funding streams were coming to an end at the end of sort of this year, beginning of next year. And this was kind of putting significant pressure on. I think there was a general feeling that, yeah, filling out grant applications and doing the necessary work to get funding now is just taking up so much time and capacity. And often there aren't kind of necessarily the skills internally to kind of, I guess, compete. You know, you're talking about kind of more competition. It felt like, yeah, that was impacting charities that didn't necessarily have the internal skills and maybe capacity to compete effectively. Yeah, that was it.
Thanks, Josie. And thanks everyone for all of your contributions to that discussion. Some things that are kind of familiar to us, and then possibly some kind of new issues coming up. It really helps us to make sure we're representing you well. So just some further information before we close. We have 2 more small charity week events. The links are kind of here in the slides. So we have a webinar on insurance and also a digital candle event. You can also take a look at our Know How Nonprofit website, where you can find advice and guidance on things like being an employer, managing volunteers, funding strategy, governance and running a charity. Chanel, I think if you could run a quick poll just to get a quick bit of feedback from everyone here about how they found this event, which really helps us to make sure we're on the right track with these. Give you all a couple of minutes to fill this in. Thanks everyone for that. You will also be sent an evaluation form in an email that follows up from this event. And please do keep in touch with us about any challenges you're experiencing, anything you want us to kind of raise with government or prioritise. You can always contact us using this email address, which is policy@ncvo.org.uk. And please also keep an eye on the NCVO blog. That's often where we'll talk about kind of different policy issues and challenges coming up. Thank you everyone for coming today. Thanks to Caroline, Chanel, and all the facilitators who've helped. Hope you all have a really good week. Thanks so much.